Dr. Eiten, Jeff, great presentation. We're here with people who get it, right? So it's great that we're having the conversation, but this message needs to go beyond where we are today. And we also recognize that there is a housing crisis, maybe a little more severe here in this region, but across the US, every community at some level is, experiencing that. And we also know that there's a real threat or occurrence of gentrification. So with that all in the mix and recognizing that, yes, transit and transportation solutions and new policy ideas will have an impact on how we can start shifting, but with the reality of recognizing that some of these folks who will have the lower life expectancies because of those conditions are going to be pushed out to new communities. So my question for both of you, from a health perspective as well as a transportation perspective, when people are moving out to other communities that are further away from the core, how, as we're designing those communities, can we implement some of these policies or ensure that we make the right decisions, even though we're trying to also combat all of the gentrification that's happening? So either one.
Well, from a health perspective, I think that one of the things that's most interesting to us that we've learned in our work is this notion of agency, this notion of control. People's sense that things aren't just happening to them, that they have some way of shaping some of the things that are happening to them. And we've recognized that that has a profound impact on the health of not just individuals, but of communities, if they feel that they have some control. So our investment is disproportionately into organizing communities so that they can actually have a much more robust way of participating in decision-making locally. We recognize that, I like to say that health is political. When I say political, I mean small p political, not partisan. But it's political in the sense that politics is the struggle over the allocation of scarce and precious social goods. And if people are not participating in that conversation, in that struggle, the likelihood that they'll get an allocation of those scarce and precious social goods goes down substantially. So we say health is fundamentally about power, voice, and participation. And our investment is to optimize the democracy in places. Small d democracy, where people are participating in transit decisions. And I gave the example of the bus rapid transit system through Oakland. And everybody was asking, well, why is a health agency spending literally millions of dollars organizing people to participate in this public process? And we say that's fundamentally what health looks like in this setting.
So I think there's a difference between the things we need to do in order to design new communities better versus retrofit our existing communities that are public health failures. So when we're designing new communities, I think there needs to be stronger recognition that our conventional tools for regulating cities are creating spectacularly bad outcomes. So, for example, most communities control density through floor area ratio restrictions as a proxy for controlling traffic. FAR restrictions are a terrible proxy for traffic. If you want to control traffic directly. What we need is not density caps, but rather minimum density thresholds. If you're not achieving a minimum of 12 units per acre in your community, you've made walkable retail illegal. We need a minimum density threshold in order to build in positive public health outcomes. Similarly, if you have a minimum parking requirement that is forcing developers to build more parking than the market would warrant, you're creating an affordable housing problem and a traffic problem. So rather than having minimum parking requirements, we need parking maximums, again, in order to achieve outcomes around affordability, around CO2 reduction, around walkability, and more sustainable communities. Most importantly, the way we analyze traffic impact for new development, focusing on the seconds delay that cars experience, is exacerbating our traffic congestion problem by forcing us to design roads that are wider than they need to be, making it more difficult for the existing folks to walk or bike or take transit. So in our new communities, we need to radically rethink the outcomes that we're looking for. Our current outcomes focus entirely on protecting the status quo. And the status quo is fundamentally inequitable and unhealthful. For retrofitting newer communities or retrofitting our existing communities, it's tougher because, of course, you need to collaborate with the status quo, the folks who are living there, and try to help them reimagine how their community could be better or more healthful. Fortunately, at least here in California, the affordability crisis and the fact that very few of us Californians, our children and grandchildren, will never be able to afford to live in our communities. That this connection to our family and our love for our family, I think, is starting to make some folks realize that holding on to the status quo is perhaps not the best that we can do.
So let's talk about that, holding on to the status quo. And you talked about the great work you're doing in Oakland and about how you looked at parking and you're changing level of service as a planner. I appreciate that, right? So, and as well as latent demand, right? Again, as a planner and doing modeling, you always hear people saying, oh, we'll get more capacity, but we know that doesn't actually happen. But the reality is, you mentioned that congestion was tied to economics, right? And the growth of our cities are also tied to economics. So the question is, as we're looking at this through an economic spectrum, and we're talking about health, right? And we know the healthcare industry is a huge industry. The economics of it all, how do we as planners and those of us who are in the development space as well as the zoning space, how do we reconcile the fact that we do have this economic force working at the same time that we're trying to do things that may intuitively not work collaboratively?
Well, I think, it's all the general rules of operating in a market economy, right? We know the ways in which a market economy harnesses greed for good and creates all of these unintended negative consequences. So our job in government is to regulate those unintended negative consequences for the public good, right? And to capture some of the value that private enterprise and profit generate, to capture some of that and translate it into the public good, and particularly translate it into public good in ways that most benefit those who are left out of the economic benefit program, right? The rising tide certainly does not lift all boats. It lifts the boats of the establishment, right?
So the rising tide and lifting. For you, Dr. Iden, how long does it take a community where the life expectancy is low to improve that life expectancy? Is it a decade? Is it several decades? Is it a generation? What are we talking about here?
Well, unfortunately, and this is, hopefully it doesn't make too many people sad, but unfortunately, it's a lot easier to shorten life expectancy than it is to lengthen it. And so we know what it takes to bring it down, and to bring it down relatively quickly. We know less about what it takes to actually lengthen it. We know a lot about communities that have long life expectancies. We know what some of the determinants of those long life expectancies are, but the challenge with life expectancy, it's a great summary measure of health status, but it's got a long runway. So, like when you die at 75, it's not because something happened to you at 74. Right. It's because something over the past 40 years was incrementally, synergistically, cumulatively, essentially eroding your well-being. And so these social determinants, you have to look at them over the long term. You can't look at them as sort of having these short-term time windows. But I do think, just on the previous question, that one of the big challenges we have in this country is the role of government, and who decides what a community should look like, and how is that process essentially refereed. And what we see in health, unfortunately, is this disproportionate dependence on the market. And the market is much more interested in downstream health, because that's where you can make money. When people get sick, you can actually try to repair them, and you can make a lot of money. The market is not interested in prevention. There's no business case for prevention, except for the Kaisers and some of the integrated delivery systems, which thankfully we're moving more towards. So government actually has to intervene to kind of impose some of the structure that's necessary to facilitate prevention. And I think that's a big challenge in both health and in transportation and all of the social determinants. But I think that one of the reasons I love working in Oakland is the sort of the strong muscular role that the government asserts on these questions. And I think that's leadership. And we have a real need for leadership in this space.
So, I have a couple more questions, but did we want to?
Keep the question.
Okay.
Here with mics.
Okay, that's fine. So, that was great with the, looking at the policy and real leadership. And we've talked about, you touched on that. Oakland is doing some great work as well. So in a policy statement from a transportation perspective, the Department of Transportation, how well received was it to start talking about health issues as you're building your strategic plan focused on transportation? Because this will be something that hopefully others will be taking back to their cities and talking about how to incorporate some of these health policy statements.
Well, I mean, fortunately, in part because of the work of Dr. Wrighton and many other people, this is not a new topic in Oakland. Transportation has placed a huge burden on the health of our residents, not only because of the lack of being able to walk or bike in many of our neighborhoods, but also the burden of the fact that Oakland got the region's freeways as opposed to San Francisco. And so the pollution impact on our low-income residential neighborhoods is also severe. We have some of the highest childhood asthma rates in the state in our low-income neighborhoods, not surprisingly. So the conversation about health is something that Oakland residents, they see it, right? There is an obvious imperative right in front of them, so the conversation wasn't that hard. It's been a little trickier for, Oakland is very much an A and a B city. Some of our zip codes in Oakland have the highest income levels in all of the United States, up in the hills, and the reverse down in the flats. And so some of our residents who are living in the A part of the city, it's taken them a little bit more to understand, but even they themselves, because many of them are aging, are concerned about how living in the hills makes them completely dependent upon their cars, and they're watching their lives shrink as their ability to drive, particularly at night, is in decline.
Yeah, I think that the, health is, one of the nice things about being in health, I like being a doctor because people assume you don't bring an agenda with you. It's sort of like, it's like a health agenda is everybody's agenda, right? Everybody wants to be healthy. There's no anti-health constituency. So when we come to the table, we come kind of as these priests almost. Like we don't have a dog in the fight. We're just trying to provide, the best knowledge and information and data that we can. And what's been wonderful over the past 20 years or so is the ability to use things like GIS and other, innovative ways of using and merging data sets to show that there are profound health associations, if not frank consequences, with some of the designs that we have in our work. So public health is, it started really in partnership with urban planning and the development of the cities movement, 150 years ago. And then health just took this detour. I mean, health just went into the medical model, the biomedical kind of world, and kind of got lost there and drove up costs. And now there's this sort of renaissance in health to come back to where we started, which is to look at the so-called social determinants, the root causes, the conditions that create opportunity for people to pursue health. And when we bring that into a planning conversation, I think it's welcome. It's generally affirming of what planners have been trying to do for years, but it also brings this data and this kind of agendaless kind of credibility that I found has been, we've always been welcomed at the tables when we come to the table. With perhaps the exception of transportation planners who don't like us, but the general planners.
We like you.
Yeah, the freeway people, I don't know.
Oh, those are different people.
It's actually really funny. If you look at the history of the transportation profession, our profession as well got its start in the early 20th century, sort of healthy cities movement, trying to prevent cholera. So The transportation engineering profession, its origin is in landscape architecture. It was around the design of the parkway systems, of the great parkways of the East Coast cities that needed some extra engineering attention to figure out how to do the funny grade separations on the Olmstedian parkway system. So it was all about health and beauty were the primary values that started my profession, which took a much bigger detour than yours did.
But let's talk about health and beauty in an equity context, right? Because even some of the greats weren't really considerate of those who were not viewed as being affluent, right? So even historically, there's been a bias towards those who would really have the benefit of having this access. And you rattled off, Jeff, some of the knowledge that everyone has, right? If you live in a low-income community, these kids may have a higher rate of asthma, lower education scores. We know all of this, and we are talking today about transportation having a role, but I don't recall, and maybe you do, developing performance measures where we're looking at them and we're overlaying, right, the impacts or the issues that are occurring in the communities that are health-related to the projects that we have in our long project list, right? If it's in the TIP or the long-range plan, and then looking at that through the lens of how do we improve a community, the health of a community, with our improvements in transportation. Now, I'm sure maybe some of you out here have done that, and that's really great, and if we could continue doing that. But Jeff, as well as Dr. Iden, if you can talk a bit about how we can start prioritizing projects and looking at it through that lens. And the other question is, I know from a transportation perspective that major infrastructure projects take decades sometimes. So maybe the timing could be aligned that as it takes us 10 years to build a corridor and put a very complete streets design in a corridor, maybe at the same time we can make an improvement in the education as well as the health conditions in that community and then start tracking that. So let's talk about that a bit.
So historically, up until maybe last year, almost all of our planning processes were run backwards. So to do a regional plan, whether it was a regional land use plan or a regional transportation plan, like you'd go and you'd ask all the municipalities and the counties, like, what are the projects that you want? And they'd put the projects that had been in the queue for 27 years that still hadn't been built because they were terrible projects and nobody really wanted them, but they were sort of marched along the queue. And then the regional agency would sort of take all of that, staple it together, and then hire transportation people like me to do an analysis, like run it through our complicated black box model, which would spit out in the end like all the ways in which spending this $5 billion was going to make the region worse by all the metrics that we had at our disposal, right? This is not the right way to do planning, right? The right way to do planning is to start with the question, what kind of a region do we want to be? How do we know if we got there? Like, what are our values? What are our goals? Do we want better public health outcomes? And then develop a set of scenarios that tries to optimize for different values, and then have a community conversation about trade-offs, right? Because that's really the game of planning, is revealing and then making decisions about trade-offs. It is not about stapling together a wish list and then running the travel demand model to see how much worse it makes everything, right? So if you don't know what you want to be, you're never going to get there. And if you don't have a way of measuring whether you've achieved what you want to be, you're also not going to get there. So we need to be asking better questions, and that means, here in California, fixing really fundamental problems like CEQA. So CEQA is a legal disclosure instrument that is designed only to ask the question, how much worse is this project going to make things? Under CEQA, it is not possible to even ask the question, how can we make things better?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that we've come to realize in our work is that equity is both an outcome and a process. And that we look for opportunities in every process to increase the voice of people who are likely to be most impacted by the outcome. And then we help them tool up with either technical support, bringing people together and organizing them so that they can be much more effective in holding the system accountable for considering and trying to prioritize the outcomes that those populations bring to the table. So I think that when you look at some of those maps that I showed you, and you look at the actual communities, those red zones, when you look at the transportation infrastructure in those red zones, or the parks infrastructure, or the food system infrastructure, it's all dilapidated, all of it. And that's not an accident. It's because of essentially those populations not being considered politically powerful enough to essentially hold the city or the decision makers accountable for equitable investments in the infrastructure. And not even equitable at that point, these communities have a greater need for those kinds of investments than some of those communities up in the hills.
That's right, and because they have the fewest choices.
Right. They're much more dependent on that infrastructure. So for us, it's about getting the fundamentals right, making sure that we recognize that these are basically political processes. And how do you win at politics? It's money and it's boots on the ground. Now, we don't have a lot of money. The developers have a ton of money, but we have a hell of a lot of boots on the ground and the potential to put boots on the ground to make these processes hyper-democratic. So that's been our mantra, is to sort of look for those points in the process where we can amp up the organized community participation in the decision-making all along the process. We think that that is critical to an equitable outcome, making sure that the process has optimized equity as well.
I'd say there's one other ingredient as well, in addition to sort of money and boots on the ground. It's also storytelling. Mm-hmm. If you've got a really good story, you can get a lot more done than if your message is sort of mangled and unclear. And if your story is super inspiring, it can become infectious, and that can help you to cultivate additional boots on the ground in order to
I totally agree with that.
spread the story.
We say that narrative, policy, and power are critical. And narrative in particular, trying to change the narrative about health from making it just about healthcare, which is about access to a doctor and your individual behavior, to essentially the conditions that you have to navigate every day in order to pursue healthy opportunity, particularly for children. So you're absolutely right. Narrative is a big part of what we invest in with our organizing, so we can bring this voice to the table in the most compelling way.
All right. I mean, this sounds great, and I appreciate it, but I hate to, poo-poo on the party. But the reality is, back to the politics, it is politics, right? And we know, again, as people who occupy this space, that when we work with NPOs, you and I, the three of us, can all have these great ideas, and we'll say, we get the boots on the ground and everybody will be excited, but we still have to balance an entire region. And if the people with the power, right, if they feel like their project in their community, which is affluent, and they're really not concerned about increasing the test scores in a low score area or improving the air quality, those projects may not make it into the next phase of the constrained plan. Those projects may not get built. So I appreciate the conversation, but I think we need to delve in a little deeper to really give the audience some food for thought on how we can go back to our communities and really make some suggestions to make some change, right? And I recognize that we can't change overnight, and we can't run back, by in Denver in 2017, we can all report back that we made these significant changes, but at least we can start moving the dial forward. And the real question is, as people who sit in the seat, right? As a director of the Department of Transportation, as a doctor, as a planner, how can we use the little bit of influence that we have as we're building policy statements? Recognizing, even with the example with CEQA, right? Even if it's established in a way that right now we find deficiencies, if you are the person who's managing the process, you still have the influence to make some changes and do things differently and implement the policy in a way that best suits your community, right? You're not going to get dinged for doing more than what's required. So keeping that in mind, what can we do? How can we leave out of here with some tools or some ideas of how we start having that conversation? And the other thing is recognizing that those people who need more assistance because of the inequity, the communities that they live in today, they may not be living in the next 5 or 10 years, right? So again, we have to have this balance as we're having this conversation, as you mentioned, Jeff, how we design for communities, retrofitting as well as new communities. So what tools can we take back that are really help move this conversation forward?
Well, so I'm not a transportation planner, so I have sympathy for all of you that have to operate in that domain. But let me tell you about what I have seen happen, because I think what I said earlier, I think, pertains to the transportation planning setting as well. In California, we have 5 million new people that have health insurance as a result of advocacy. The status quo was pushing against that. We have 5 million new people. I mean, literally half the new people that have been insured in the country are in California. We have 1 million people who are now eligible to reclassify their former felonies into misdemeanors under Prop 47. That was inconceivable 5 years ago. We have 250,000 undocumented kids that are getting Medi-Cal now in California. Also, inconceivable a few years ago. California is now advocating to get undocumented adults access to the health exchange in California, advocating with the Obama administration to let undocumented people buy health insurance alongside all of the other people who are getting federal subsidies. Inconceivable. We have 300,000 fewer suspensions and expulsions in our schools, which is a 40+% drop just in 3 years. Again, inconceivable, because things are happening here because of advocacy, because of people organizing and building power and moving systems and changing the status quo. So, as I said earlier, get the fundamentals right. I know of no other way to make change. And I'm all ears. If people have other ideas, let me know. But I don't think the transportation planning domain is so different from Sacramento, looking at a very fixed budget and sort of the costs of healthcare, or looking at the criminal justice budget, or looking at schools and the school discipline issue. These seem to be impenetrable barriers a few years ago, and they've all moved, and they've moved fast and far in ways that people couldn't even anticipate, because we got the fundamentals right. So that's what I would argue is the recipe for making change in any of these places.
Yep.
I would say that one of the first steps is that we have to recognize our power. The least powerful person in this room has extraordinary power and privilege compared to most residents of our country. You all have a remarkable amount of control and influence over these things that we've just been talking about today. I think the next thing is to recognize that in our roles, to the extent that we are supporting the status quo, we are ourselves driving inequitable outcomes. We are every day contributing to the problem. And it's hard to see that, because the ways in which we contribute are in 1,000 microscopic ways, right? In our country, we've dealt with many of the very big, highly visible issues of inequity. But we're stuck with the 1,000 small issues that are still driving inequitable outcomes. So looking closely at how we ourselves every day contribute in microscopic ways to inequity, and finding ways to change that. Finding ways in every one of our small actions to drive more equitable and more healthful outcomes. It means, as we said earlier, sort of finding and then voicing better stories so that others can see the ways in which all of us who control the status quo are driving inequitable outcomes, and can see how much better things can be if we do the opposite, right? None of this is going to be solved through any one act of Congress or any change to the California Environmental Quality Act or switching from level of service to per capita VMT. It's going to be solved through the 1,000 small things, just as getting our health back is not just switching suddenly to a new diet, but undoing 40 years of small damage that we've done to our physical bodies. We need to do the same thing to the body of our governments.
So there's a lot of work that we have to do when we go back, right? So We have to use the power that we have, right, that we didn't realize that we have. So it's kind of like being in Professor X's home for special people. We have now all been,
Very
you
special
know,
people.
we all have power that we're leaving out with, and we have to use it wisely. We also heard a bit about the fundamentals and the importance of advocacy. And I know we have several representatives here of advocacy groups, and getting the advocates to be more aligned specifically as it relates to the policy issues and the way we implement policy is also important in order for us to move the dial forward. We also recognize that the health situation, healthcare, and access is all connected. And it's not about finding a doctor because you feel sick. It's about making sure you have preventative services, right? And we talked about how economically that's not as economically viable right now, but maybe that's a way we can use our power to make that a little more economically viable. We also heard about the importance of not staying within the status quo. We have to go beyond what we're doing today in order to make these great changes. And also the collaboration about working together across different businesses, transportation, healthcare, education. Everybody who's in a community that helps to build a livable community has to be a part of the conversation in order for us to get to the next step. That's the summation of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you will also help me in thanking both Jeff and Dr. Eiten for participating with us today.
Great job.